By the third day, something shifted, not dramatically. Not with screaming or declarations or any sort of narrative announcement. Just a quiet, deeply unsettling behavioral change that I only noticed because I talked too much and therefore noticed patterns very quickly. Which was that whenever I entered a room, everyone else immediately left it. Not urgently, not panicked, but with the subtle coordination of people who had silently agreed on a survival strategy. Like the first time I walked into the kitchen. That morning, and my stepmother, who had been standing perfectly still stirring a pot, suddenly became extremely invested in wiping a counter that was already clean while both stepsisters froze mid-argument. Locked eyes with me for half a second, and then independently chose different exits. One backing into a wall and pretending it had always been her plan to inspect it closely. The other turning toward the window and staring at the sky like clouds. Had just invented something revolutionary, so I paused in the doorway and said very gently, "Oh, are we not making eye contact now?" Which caused the shorter stepsister to let out a small involuntary yelp before slapping a hand over her own mouth. And I thought maybe I was imagining things until it happened again 10 minutes later in the hallway. When I rounded the corner holding a basket of laundry and found all three of them walking toward me in a line. Only for them to stop abruptly like they'd hit an invisible wall, whisper something frantic to each other, and then scatter in 3 different directions as if I were some kind of conversational wildfire. So I stood there alone holding socks. And wondered out loud, is this a new house rule? Or are we just experimenting with avoidance? Which I only said to myself quietly. But unfortunately, the taller stepsister was still within earshot and screamed, "Don't answer her," at the top of her lungs, which confirmed my suspicion that this was no longer accidental, this was policy. And by lunchtime, the pattern was undeniable because every time I approached a space dining room, pantry, stairwell, the people already there would suddenly remember urgent tasks elsewhere. Like my stepmother discovering she absolutely had to reorganize the spice rack in the farthest room of the house the moment I sat down. Or one stepsister fake sneezing and announcing she needed air before sprinting away, while the other attempted to hold a door shut against me with her body weight while whispering, "If we don't engage, she can't start," which I heard and responded to by saying, calmly and sincerely, "Start what?" causing her to scream and fall backward. At which point I realized they weren't just avoiding me. They were afraid of something very specific, which was that if they let me speak uninterrupted for more than 3 seconds, I would accidentally explain their lives back to them, so I tried to be considerate and announced my presence in advance, calling out things like, "Just passing through, no questions," or "I'm only here for water. This is not a conversation," which helped a little until the taller stepsister began wearing what appeared to be wadded cloth in her ears, glaring at me triumphantly as if she'd invented silence itself, prompting me to say, "Oh, ear protection. Smart. Overstimulation is real," which made her scream, "It's not for that," while the shorter one attempted a different strategy. By talking constantly anytime I was nearby, narrating her own movements at high speed. I'm walking, I'm not listening, I'm not listening." So I waited politely until she ran out of breath and then said, "Okay, your turn's done, quick question." Which sent her into such a state that she dropped a tray of dishes and started crying about how everything used to be simple before I arrived. And I tried to comfort her by saying, "I don't think it was simple, I think it was just unexamined." Which, in hindsight, may not have been the right phrasing, because that was the moment my stepmother finally snapped and gathered them both in the main hall to issue what she clearly believed was a decisive rule, announcing with the authority of someone clinging to control by her fingernails, that from this moment forward, no one was to speak to me, respond to me, or acknowledge me in any way, which I nodded along to and summarized by saying, "Got it. Passive communication. Very advanced." At which point she screamed, "Stop labeling IT," and stormed off, leaving the stepsisters to implement the policy with mixed results, since ignoring someone who continues speaking politely into the silence is surprisingly difficult, especially when that person says things like, "I respect your boundary, just so you know this silence is still technically communication," or "If you change your mind, I'll be right here, audibly existing," which caused them to plug their ears harder and chant, "Don't engage," Don't engage, like a mantra. While the servants, who had learned from the first few days that life became objectively easier when things were explained, began adapting in a very different way by anticipating my questions before I asked them, handing me items without prompting, nodding along preemptively, and once even rearranging an entire work schedule before I could finish the sentence. I was just thinking, which I found impressive and remarked on by saying, "Wow, you're all really picking this up." A statement that made both stepsisters screams stop praising them simultaneously, and by the afternoon the house had split cleanly into two camps. Those who avoided me at all costs, and those who functioned more smoothly when I was nearby. A dynamic that deeply unsettled my stepmother because it meant her authority no longer controlled the flow of work. Language did, and language, unfortunately. For her was my favorite hobby, so she tried one last tactic by pretending everything was normal. Calling everyone to dinner and sitting down with exaggerated calm, smiling too widely and speaking too sweetly. Which I interpreted as an invitation to check in and responded to by saying, "Before we eat, quick pulse check, how's everyone feeling about the new communication policy?" At which point both stepsisters lost what little composure they had left, one standing up and screaming, "You ruin everything just by talking," while the other threw her napkin on the floor and yelled, "Why won't you just be quiet like normal people?" And I said, sincerely confused, "Is that a request or a value judgment?" Which caused my stepmother to slam her hands on the table and shout, "Enough," loud enough to shake the dishes. And for a moment I thought that might be it, that perhaps this was the peak of the situation, until the trumpet sounded outside, sharp and official, cutting cleanly through the chaos, freezing everyone in place as a royal messenger stepped inside with a scroll, announcing in a booming voice that the palace would be hosting a royal ball and all eligible households were formally invited. And the transformation was immediate and alarming, with my stepmother straightening her posture, smoothing her dress, and smiling like she'd never raised her voice in her life, while the stepsisters began shrieking in excitement, yelling about dresses and jewels and how this was finally their chance. And I picked up the invitation, reading it carefully, out loud, noting the date, the time, the formal tone, the implied expectations, and finally saying, "Oh, this is a very structured event," which made the room go silent again. Everyone slowly turning to look at me as I added thoughtfully, "High stakes external stakeholders, strict dress code," and I looked up to see pure fear on their faces, not excitement, not anger. Just the dawning realization that whatever they thought this ball was going to be, it was now also something I would inevitably explain in detail. And my stepmother grabbed my arm and hissed, "You are not going," which I accepted without argument, smiling and replying, "Totally fine." I'll just note that excluding a participant from a key social event can sometimes create long-term tension and misalignment. A sentence that caused the taller stepsister to collapse into a chair yelling, "She's doing IT again," while the shorter one covered her ears and screamed, "Make her stop talking." And as they spiraled and the invitation trembled slightly in my hand, I realized with a calm certainty that they weren't avoiding me anymore because I was annoying. They were avoiding me because I was inevitable, and this was no longer just a household problem. This was about to become a palace-level situation.